So today I'm going to continue our read aloud. Wayside School is Falling Down from where we left off before spring break. So we were on chapter 18, The Substitute. Benjamin couldn't take it any longer. Today was the day he would finally tell Mrs. Jules his real name. So what if nobody likes me, he thought. So what if I stop getting high marks? "Hi, Mark," said Jason. "Hi, Mark," said Stephen. "Hi, hi," he grumbled repeatedly, and then started up the stairs. "Hi, Mark," said Phoebe as she took a seat next to her. "Guess what? We have a substitute." "Woohoo!" shouted Mauricia. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class loved it when they had substitute teachers. They loved playing mean and horrible tricks on them. Benjamin frowned. He finally had the courage to tell Mrs. Jules his real name. "Rats," he said. "That's a good idea," said Terence. "We'll put dead rats in her desk." "Let's trick her into going outside," said Joy, "then lock her out of the room." "But what if she tells Mr. Kidswatter?" asked Eric Fry. "So what?" said Joy. "She'll have to go all the way down to the office and then all the way back up. By then we'll unlock the door. Mr. Kidswatter will think she's bonkers." Benjamin looked at the substitute teacher sitting at Mrs. Jewell's desk. She looked like a nice lady. She wore tiny spectacles and had her long gray hair tied in a ponytail. He felt sorry for her, and he felt sorry for himself. "I was going to tell Mrs. Jewels my name," he thought. "I really was." The substitute stood up and walked to the center of the room. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Franklin." Nobody said good morning back to her. Calvin handed Benjamin a note. "At 10 o'clock, drop your book on the floor. Pass it on." Benjamin read it, then passed it to Todd. "Okay, who can tell me what page we're on?" asked Mrs. Franklin. "Page 17," called Myron. A 112, said Mauricia. 98, said Eric Evans. 3,000, said Joe. Mrs. Franklin just smiled. "I guess we'll have to study all of those pages then," she said. Benjamin raised his hand. "Yes, the handsome young man in the red shirt," said the substitute. He told her the correct page. "We're on page 102," he said. "Thank you," said the substitute. "And what is your name, please?" Benjamin thought a moment. He looked around the room, then boldly told the truth. "My name is Benjamin," he stated proudly. Several kids started to snicker. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute. There were even more snickers. "You're welcome," said Benjamin. He felt good, even if the other kids were laughing at him. Mrs. Franklin asked a question from page 102. Jason answered it correctly. "Very good," said the substitute. "And what is your name, please?" Jason looked around. "Benjamin," he asserted. Half the class giggled. "Thank you, Benjamin," said Mrs. Franklin, and the other half giggled then. Dana answered the next question. "Oh, and what is your name?" Mrs. Franklin asked Dana. "Benjamin," Dana blurted out, then fell giggling onto the floor. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute. Everyone was hysterical. "My, it is certainly a pleasure to teach such a happy class of students," said the substitute. "Who knows the answer to question 4?" They all raised their hand. They all wanted to tell the substitute that their names were Benjamin. They were having so much fun they forgot to drop the book on the floor at 10 o'clock. At recess, everyone congratulated Benjamin on his good trick. "You're a genius, Mark," said Todd. "Benjamin is such a funny name," said Jason. "How'd you ever think of it?" "Well, really, my name is Benjamin," said Benjamin. "Yeah, so is mine," said Stephen. "Mine too," said Leslie, and they all laughed. "Do you think she really believes we're all named Benjamin?" asked Eric Evans. "Probably," said Joy. "She's so stupid." If she thought we were lying, she would have gotten mad," said Eric Bacon. The bell rang and they all hurried back to class. After recess was social studies. "Who would like to read?" said Mrs. Franklin. Every hand went up. "Okay, Benjamin," said Mrs. Franklin as she pointed at Dana, and everyone laughed. Dana giggled a few seconds, then got control of herself and read from the book. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute when Dana was finished reading. "Okay, Benjamin, you may read next," she said, pointing to Terence. And everyone laughed. It was the first time all year Terence had volunteered to read. All day, everyone paid very close attention. They all wanted the teacher to call on them. Because, as funny as it was when Mrs. Franklin called somebody else Benjamin, it was even funnier when she called you Benjamin. So everyone worked hard and listened closely. As a result, they learned more from the substitute in one day than they usually learned from Mrs. Jules in a whole month. When the final bell rang, everyone crowded around her desk. Are you coming back tomorrow, Mrs. Franklin? Asked Eric Bacon. Please, Mrs. Franklin, say you will, pleaded Kathy. You're the best teacher we've ever had, said Jason. The substitute smiled. School is over, she said. You don't have to call me Mrs. Franklin anymore. That sounds so formal. Since we're friends now, you may all call me by my first name. What's your first name? Asked Mauricia. The substitute gathered up her things and threw them into her straw bag. It's Benjamin, she said, then walked out of the room. Everyone stared at her silently. Do you think that's really her name? Asked Joy. Chapter 19. A Bad Case of the Sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would be crammed with thousands of screaming students scurrying to their rooms, but now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and toward the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Mrs. Zarves taught the class on the 19th story, and there was no Mrs. Zarves. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th? Suddenly she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of the way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron's elbow jammed into her stomach. Umph, she said as she grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They race up the stairs, and when they get to Mrs. Jewell's rooms, they're too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jewell's class were silly, even Rondi. Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason hated her, or else he loved her. Allison wasn't sure which. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desks, and their tongues hanging out. You could have said you were sorry, Allison said as she walked past them. She walked straight to her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside of it. Look what I brought, he said. What's the name of your goldfish? Asked Mrs. Jules. Shark, said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. It makes him feel important, Jason explained. Where should I put him? How about on top of the coat closet, suggested Mrs. Jules. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tippy toes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly the chair toppled over. Ah! Whoop! Yelled Jason as he fell to the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jules hurried to the back of the room. Quick, somebody fill the bowl with water, she said. Where's Shark? Jason made a face. I swallowed him? The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell and told everyone to settle down. We have a bad case of the sillies this morning, she said. She took roll. Who's absent? She said. Allison, said Rondi. Very funny, Rondi, said Allison. Anybody besides Allison? Asked Mrs. Jules. I'm here, Mrs. Jules, said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jules couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in the class. Just Allison, said Mrs. Jules, and she marked it on her green roll card. Damien, will you please take the roll card to the office? Allison stood up quickly. I'm not absent, she said. Damien took the roll card and walked out the door. Mrs. Jules, did you just mark me absent? Asked Allison. Mrs. Jules didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. Mrs. Jules, did you mark me absent? She asked again. Mrs. Jules looked up. Terence, what are you whispering about? Nothing, mumbled Terence. If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me, said Mrs. Jules. Get off my case, buzzard face, said Terence. Terence, exclaimed Mrs. Jules, go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline. But that's what I said to Jenny, Terence protested. Mrs. Jules, what about me? Allison demanded. Mrs. Jules ignored her. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear her. Allison faced the class. Can't anybody see me? She asked. Nobody answered her. Rondi, shouted Allison. Dana? Jason? This isn't funny, said Allison. I know you're all just pretending. She stood right in front of Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared him straight in the eye. I know you can see me, she said. You're trying not to laugh. He stared right through her. She stuck her tongue out at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. Yuck, she exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. Have you gone crazy? Shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down the stairs to the class on the 29th floor. Come quick, she said. There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules' class. No one heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the class on the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her cheeks as is the whole school playing a joke on me, she wondered. It's not funny, she shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone somewhere would notice her. Fish for sale, fresh fish, fat fish, get your fresh fat fish. A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the classrooms. Shh, she whispered. This is school, not a fish market. You can hear me? Asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. Yes, I can hear you, said the woman sternly. My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done. I'm sorry, said Allison, but something's wrong with Mrs. Jewell's class. Well, you'd better come in here, said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. What is your name? The teacher asked. Allison? Boys and girls, this is Allison, the teacher announced to her students. She'll be joining our class. What? Said Allison. But my name is Mrs. Zarv, said the teacher. Welcome to the 19th story. And that's where we are going to stop for this one.